Welcome to today's second panel, which is on the political economy of climate policy in Iraq. A few quick housekeeping notes. We have simultaneous translation available online and in the hall through the headsets. The event is on the record and live streamed. For social media, you can tweet by using the hashtag Iraq Initiative. And for those online, you can submit your questions through the Q&A function. I'm going to introduce the panel briefly. We have Sareen Karajerjian. She's from the Arab Reform Initiative. She leads their environmental politics program. We have Sama Al-Muqdadi. He's a climate expert and a water expert with Relief International, as well as with IRIS. We have Glade Alan with Chatham House and their environment program. And last but not least, Torhan Al-Mufti. He's the advisor to the PM on water issues. So today's topic is a very complex one. I think it's important just that you know that if you are interested in this topic, there are a lot of places that you can go for resources after the conversation. For the MINA level political economy of climate change, actually, Sareen's group, Arab Reform Initiative, has a lot of great resources and publications on this issue, and you should check them out. For the Iraq climate policy level, being a bit selfish here, I think the institute that I'm affiliated with, IRIS, has a great track record with this, and we've actually, in the last couple of days, just published a report that I think is one of the more comprehensive political economy analyses of Iraq's climate situation. And then for scientific papers, for those of you who really want to nerd out on this, you have scholars like Sama and some of his colleagues who have published extensively on this issue from a more scientific perspective. So let's get to going with the questions. I'm going to start today with Sareen. Again, Sareen's group has done quite a lot of very important work on particularly the grassroots level. And trying to understand what is the landscape of activism and what are their grievances in the Iraqi context. Could you give us a sense of what this work has illuminated?
Thank you, Mac, and thank you, Chatham House, for this wonderful opportunity to be here. So first, I'd like also to thank our colleagues, Safa Khalaf, Julia Sher, and Taif Al-Khudari, who have done amazing field work and relentlessly in Iraq, trying to portray what is an environmental activist today in the context of Iraq, historically and up until today. So if we look in 2022, thousands of people were hospitalized for urgent treatment for respiratory diseases after sandstorms involved vast swaths of the western and central regions of the country, grounding flights and shutting down schools and public offices. As sociologist Zainab Shukair puts it, climate change for Iraq is not an abstract future threat. It is a measurable process that is already dragging down the country. In only 2 decades, Iraq has gone from water abundant to water stressed. And considering these conditions, scholars of Iraq are increasingly drawing attention on how environmental degradation intersects with infrastructural, political, and social degradation to affect all aspects of life in Iraq. Omar Diwashi, our colleague, refers to the toxicity of everyday survival in examining how depleted uranium from the US wars has penetrated the quotidian realities of life in Iraq. Zahra Ali argues that analyzing structural toxicity defined as the structural conditions of everyday life and livelihood, such as health and sanitary infrastructures and environmental conditions. When we think of environmentalism and environmental mobilization, as you mentioned, Mac, the actions and identities that naturally come to mind are the activism or the advocacy efforts of civic actors who self-define as environmental activists, climate activists, or human rights activists concerned with the environment. We've actually published a piece by Safa Khalaf last year, so I would urge you to go back to our Arab Reform Initiative website. So moreover, although the environment has not been a priority for the region's governments, when they have turned to it, they have often done so under the rubric of public health. In Iraq, the existence of the Ministry of Health and Environment until 2023 is a testament both to how politicians did not deem the environment as a priority to merit its own ministry. but also to their association of the environment with health, even after the two portfolios were split ministerially in 2023. The relevant parliamentary committee is still called the Environment and Health Committee. So in October 2019, if we look back, the largest protest in Iraq's history erupted. Hundreds of thousands took the streets and squares across the country, where they persisted for months in the face of ferocious violence by the regime that left around 500 protesters dead and over 20,000 injured in the first 6 months. Thawrat Tashrin can also be seen through another prism. In addition to its more familiar political and social dimensions, the uprising can also be seen as an ecological rebellion. As Regine Shahakian argues, young protesters across the regions, sects and ethnicities demanded clean water, organized to clean city streets, and asserted they were creating an alternative green zone in Baghdad. In Baghdad's Tahrir Square, protesters produced a material, discursive, and effective space in which they could meet, live together, and negotiate an alternative social contract and new codes of conduct put forward by public commons and experience a different social order. And when a UN official expressed grave concerns over threats of closure of roads to oil installations, causing billions in losses, protesters responded with a mural depicting an oil rig, a raised middle finger, with the words, "Here is your oil world." As Sahakian states, the protesters' rallying cry, "We want a country," is first and foremost a demand by Iraq's youth for sustainable future. We can continue later if I have the time, but yeah.
Thank you, Sareen. I think the idea of an ecological rebellion just shows how salient environmental issues are within the Iraqi political space. It's no longer outside of politics as it was perhaps in the first few years after 2003. Dr. Torhan, we'd like to move to sort of the government's perspective on this issue. Obviously, Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Sudani has, in his public statements, given a lot of support for climate change efforts. And certainly at the level of rhetoric, there's no question that this government has put a kind of shining light on the issue of climate change. But what I'd like you to try and do is give us a sense of the reality. What is the government actually doing on the ground to affect some of these visions, and what progress has been made?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. First of all, I would like to give some brief about what's going on as a climate change in Iraq. You know, in Iraq now, we're suffering from desertification. Until now, we have about 30 million dönum, it's suitable for agriculture. We're afraid with next 10 years, it will reduce to 10 million dönum. The other thing that we have is the rainfall line, which that means all area north of this line can agriculturing with rainfall, not using water supply. It's start to shift toward the north about 90 kilometers. It was, if the people know geography of Iraq, it was in north of Dus Khurmata. Now it is south of Erbil. So all that area, 90 kilometer length and about 400 kilometer width, it's start to be desertification. Include many important provinces and cities like Kirkuk and part of Mosul and part of Erbil. The other thing that we have now, it's what Sareen mentioned about the sandstorm. Actually, it's a dust storm. It's different in particle, in size. Sandstorm used to have in Iraq from 100 years ago. It's stay suspending this particle about a few minutes, not more 5 minutes. But what we have now, it is dust storm. This suspension's particle stays over 6 hours in suspending in the air. And one of the records before 5 years ago, in 1 year there was about 150 dust storm in Iraq. This is one of the most important points for the healthcare of the people. The other thing that we have now, it's about the air pollution in the mega cities like Baghdad, Mosul, Basra, and so on. What we did as a government against, or to, let me say, to rebuilding the environment. You know, the rebuilding the environment, it will take time. It's not just sewage you can on or off. The most important point is about the culture. Iraqi culture is not with the environment because of what we been face to face in many wars and embargo, and in 2003 the change of the regime. The people used to use the woods and the forest as a fuel. So we need, for the first step, to make the culture of the environment, and that we're working on that as a government. There is a cabinet decision about that. There is an agreement about that. There is an initiative agreement from the Environment Ministry about that. The other point, and it is one of the most important points, is what we did with the Turkey about the water supply. You know, until now, there is no international agreement, Iraq with the Turkey or with the Iran about the agreement of the water supply. Iran and Turkey, they suppose themselves as upstream and we are downstream. They not admit it is coastal countries. So according to that, they suppose themselves upstream, say they will give us any amount they want to give. There is no agreement. There is understanding. What we did now with Turkey, and we working, and today is very good, the result, we have the result. We made kind of understanding, water/economic. So by dealing with Turkey in economic situation, we have now constantly water supply. For example, last year, in this day, like last year, water reserve in Iraq, it was about 4.7 billion cubic meter. Now we have almost 15. It is still not big, but it is triple side more than what we had in last year. And the other thing that we're working on that, and this is very important. In fact, Iraq until now, it's clear from any law or any legislation about groundwater. So now we are working for draft writing law about the groundwater and how we can use groundwater and keep it away from pollution and something like that. And there is, again, there is a decision from cabinet for the farmers to use new technology for irrigation system. And there is soft loan and log loan for this kind of technician if the farmers want to establish and working on that. And we put a very real condition for the industries should be friendly to the environment. One of the frighten of our government, if we cannot dealing good with the environment, is the demographic change in Iraq. You know, in this year and the previous year, there was more than 70,000 family who left their town and go to the big cities. And that's mean they should have a job, they should have area for residence, they should have opportunity for life. And this is one of the big frighten for the government to make this kind of the demographic change and, of course, impact of environmental and ecosystems as well as the health. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Torhan. Sam, I'm wondering if you could give some reflections based off of your experience and expertise in dealing with these issues in Iraq and reflect on basically the government's program. You know, what was mentioned here is there's been progress in everything from infrastructure to bilateral relations to pollution to groundwater maintenance. Is this really happening on the ground?
Well, thank you very much, Mac. Thanks for Chatham House having me here today. Actually, I'm quite happy to hear that's nice news from Dr. Torhan, but so far, what I see in the reality is something else. Because so far, these plans and nice statements, even on political level, more or less, are word on paper. But when it comes to an action, we're going to have a lot of obstacles. First of all, we have to realize that climate change and economy is a complex system. And this complex system needs a very deep understanding how it works and what is the dynamic. And it is most subject to political debate and with very little of technical challenge to be, implemented. So Iraq, for example, has been committed to the international or global goal for agenda for 2030. However, there are some requests that Iraq should reduce the emissions. But there is a conflict of interest here with the Iraqi on the state level that reducing the emissions, that's mean we are reducing the only source of income for the country. And to counter that traditional, I would say, trade-off for Iraq since long, which is find a balance between oil production, sustainable natural resources, plus the political stability, which is a very sensitive equation, I would say, and for any government. It's not an easy task to handle. However, from my standing point, I believe we need to have what I call a paradigm shift in leadership philosophy. Because if you go back now to how we manage our resources internally, I'm not talking now about the transboundary with upstream countries. This is probably we need one day to talk about that. However, we need to shift from water supply to water demand philosophy, and we need to shift from the flood management to drought management, because the foundation of Iraq has been based on the floods, and all of the water project that has been done in the last century is based on the flood concern. Now we need to shift more in the philosophy to the drought management from one side. Actually, given the climate change impact, we need to go furthermore by having resilience management system, because sometimes you have a 1 year, for example, 2018, we have a dry year, and then followed by a wet year in 2019, we have the floods. So we need to have this resilient as well in management system. Again, what we need as a tools in the government, and Dr. Torhan, he has already mentioned, I'm quite happy that he said that we have no legislation for the groundwater. This is true. We don't have an estimation for the groundwater. We are abusing our resources by drilling wells, and these wells in a random way, and we don't have really estimate how much that we should really invest in that direction of groundwater. But all of these plans, it need also to invest in technology. And this is another piece of puzzle that we need to consider. Technology also need a shift here from conventional approach to unconventional approach. The unconventional, I mean here, by using the smart irrigation, and even for, because the irrigation system that we are using is outdated. We spend more than 80% from our water resources in the sector, so we need to invest more in this direction. The water treatment and water desalination also, water harvesting as well. So end of the day, all of these nice, I would say, tools and technology, it is under the name of decision makers, and decision makers so far then not given a priority to these type of project. We have two very simple examples. If you go back now to in 2015, when there is a restructuring in the Iraqi government, we see the first ministry has been sacrificed as the Ministry of Environment. They put it under the Ministry of Health, which make absolutely no sense. Another example, if you just review a very simple calculation for the last few years of the national budget, you're going to figure out there is only 1% has been allocated from the national budget to two important ministries, which is Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Water Resources. Now this gives you a symptoms that the decision makers are not really give a priority to this aspect. So I'm going to stop here, then we can probably talk later about other aspects.
I think this question of the minimal government financing is one
أعتقد
that
أن هذا السؤال المتعلق بالإنفاق بالحد الأدنى من طرف الحكومة هذا أمر يجب فهمه. كما تعلمون في آخر أسبوعين تركيز في الأخبار على مؤتمر الأطراف للمناخ. العراق عنده وفد ضخم من بغداد ومن حكومة كردستان حضروا لذلك لأسابيع وأشهر كل أسبوع.
What benefit does Iraq get from these kinds of multilateral engagements? Is there something, help us understand the kind of both the geopolitics around this kind of engagement, but also, what is what's the win for Iraq for engaging at that level?
Yeah, thanks, Mac. And I think we can see Iraq would situate itself in the negotiations as between a rock and a hard place when it comes to climate change, because on the one hand, it's on the front line, as everyone has talked about, in terms of heat, dust storms, droughts, and they're reducing its capacity to build its non-oil economy. On the other hand, Iraq is still extremely dependent on oil and oil for foreign exchange revenue and oil for the government budget. I think the government budget is about 85% dependent on the oil revenues, maybe more, and in terms of exports, about 95% dependent for the foreign exchange. So that high dependence, faces it means that Iraq faces the prospect of high economic risk from the very actions that are taken globally to mitigate climate change. And at the same time, its capacity to diversify is challenged by the water and heat and extreme weather impacts. So just to give you a flavor of why its position is fraught, its stance is fraught in the negotiations, and that really has come through in the speech of the president in Baku. So I think on the one hand, we can see Iraq aligns itself with the OPEC Plus group in terms of maybe taking a conservative line on how fast we want to move on that transition away from fossil fuels that was agreed in Dubai last year. And by the way, Iraq was one of the countries alongside Saudi Arabia and Nigeria which argued against the wording phase out and in favor of transitioning away, which is a slightly more moderate language in there. But still, there was an agreement in the UAE consensus on contributions to the transitioning away from fossil fuels in the energy system for the first time. It does say in a just, orderly and equitable way as well, which is very important for Iraq, and we'll come back to that. So meanwhile, while it sort of situates itself with the OPEC Plus group, I wouldn't say it was entirely aligned in the sense that Iraq's national interest is in speeding up action on climate change because of the extreme impacts that it faces. And we know that every fraction of a degree of warming is going to exacerbate those impacts, and it has an outsized impact really for Iraq because of its vulnerabilities, because of the decades of conflict that it suffered, and because of its lack of resilience in terms of finance. So I think there's three things really that the delegation would want out of going to COP. One is to raise the profile. So you heard in the president's speech, he actually focused on climate justice, which is quite interesting for current and future generations. He talked about those dual challenges on the mitigation side and on the adaptation side. And he kind of wanted to position Iraq in readiness for receiving climate finance and maybe loss and damage transfer as well. I think the second thing is teaming up with the GCC and Iran in terms of forming a coordinated group that can negotiate better for finance and assistance through transition and work together on negotiations. I'm not sure if that's really worked out so well. We know Iran's position because of the geopolitics right now is quite weak, and I don't think that that's really come together yet. And then the third thing is multilateral partnerships. So you see Iraq talking to the IEA, the International Energy Agency, in terms of a partnership on the energy sector and efficiency and transition. You see it talking to the EU, the multilateral development banks, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. It's really eager for those just transition partnerships that some other countries are now working out. So there's the three things. I think the KRG presence is also interesting. They've sort of more stressed their water woes, but also the need to provide for displaced populations and refugees, the humanitarian edge.
Thank you, Gleda. We'll do a couple other quick questions, and then we'll come to the audience for your questions. Just a reminder to those of you online, you can submit through the Zoom function. Dr. Torhan, I wanted to highlight the point that Dr. Sama mentioned around this figure of 1%. 1% of the budget being directed towards Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Water. Now, whether it's 1% or 2% or whatever the actual number is really besides the point. It's not a whole lot of financing. And beyond that, what we hear in doing interviews across the government on this issue is that when it comes to implementing the kinds of water infrastructures that are necessary, even when the money is there, it's often, caught up in all sorts of bureaucratic issues, political issues, and so projects are still following this same kind of difficulty that always, presents itself in Iraq. And so, could you give us a sense of how the government is thinking about both this financing aspect and the implementation aspect?
In general, Iraq economic is very simple. We sell crude oil, we got the money, we spend the money. That's it. And this is not just now, it's from decades, already. What we did now with this government, at the first step to change this philosophy, now we have a 3 years budget. Each government used to have a 1 year budget and year after year, and so that the project did not finish because they should stay after the end of the year for 3 or 4 or 5 months until we prove the new budget. So in the general, for the whole of Iraq, for the first step now, we have 3 years budget. This is a good point. The second point, if we come back to the budget of the Water Supply Ministry, what we did now to jump on this case, now we have a special fund for irrigation and water treatment and sewage water. We put in that almost about $3 million now, and it will rise up maybe 2 or 3 billion for next year. And this fund, it's especially take several thousand barrels of crude oil, oil, per day for this, specified for this fund. So we're trying to make solution for this kind of projects, important project like environment and sewage water treatment and irrigation by this fund.
Sama, I wonder if you have any reflections on the financing aspect, and then also I'd like to come back to a point you made about the data landscape. You were mentioning that for groundwater, we really just don't have a lot of data. And I think across the sectors when it comes to climate, the data is not very solid, and because of that, I've heard you mention, maybe quite provocatively in a few different conferences, that you don't agree with this number that gets thrown around about Iraq being the 5th country most affected by climate change. And I just would like you to give us a sense of why that is.
Well, first of all, the 1% for both ministries combined. That's mean 0.5% for each, the Ministry of Water Resources and Ministry of Agriculture. With respect to this very fancy statement that Iraq is one of the top 5 countries is influenced by climate change, we have approved this is definitely is not the case. We are dealing with, at least in Iraq when it comes to the climate change impact, what I'm call it is the enigma of climate change narratives. We have at least 5 narratives when it comes to climate change. We have the state actors narrative, We do have the private sector narrative, which is basically the oil and gas industry. We do have the international agencies and civil society. We have public, and not least, we have the scientific community. So we should be rather careful when dealing with data like this, because each group, they do have different perception on climate change impact, and each narratives have different priority and challenge. So we are dealing with non-homogeneous system, and the high probability to generate misinformation. And if you go back to this statement, which is available in, by the way, the UNEP report, and it referenced under Hamid 2009. If you go back to the reference in this report, you're going to find out there is no citation under Hamid 2009. If you dig deep and go to the original publication for Hamid 2009, you will figure out Hamid is not the original source for this information. You go back to the original source, which is on the website. It's a commercial company. They're dealing with satellite image, and guess what? Iraq is not available, even the radar. So we have to be careful, and there is a great book for the author, Joel Best. It is The Diamond, Lies and Statistics. He is reflecting on this type of statistics, and in the page 90, he said, we should be rather careful when it comes to rounding numbers like 1/5, 1/4, because most probably this is either to regenerate or represent it, or even it has been manipulated to reflect the author objective, but has nothing to do with reality. And unfortunately, many agencies, they took this sentence and they try to, I mean, it's a testy statement at the end of the day, because people, they like this shock information. And they try to take this tasty statement to urge some local authorities to make an action, as well as to attract donors. And by this, it goes to the social media. And the social media, it has been digested by many activists. And these activists, driven by passion, and they promote it to local community. And by this, we have a snowball growing with the time until the end of the day that the government, they treat it as a fact. Actually, we have to invest more in decent research, and we have to be rather careful when dealing with such a statement. And I remember one of the very nice statement for the Benjamin Disraeli. He is the former British Prime Minister. He said there are 3 types of lies. There are lies, dumb lies, and statistics.
Yeah, I think obviously, Dr. Sameh, and I know you quite well from working on these issues over the years. Just to be clear, Sameh is not saying that climate change is not a problem in Iraq. It obviously is. But the data landscape and the kind of actual empirical work that's being done in the country is weak. And so making these kind of grand statements is often an opportunity for government actors to basically say the problem is climate change. It's not about the things that we're actually responsible for, which is effective water management, climate policy, and all the rest of it. So, so definitely a call for more research and scientific work in the Iraqi arena.
Just one minute, if you don't mind. According to the census and according to the number of exact for groundwater, actually in 2014 there is a very good study in details about groundwater, about the whole water in Iraq, but it is classified. And now there is a very big technical team. They're working to update this kind of information.
So yeah, I mean, and we've all read this classified study. I think it's gotten around, and it is thorough, but it's not scientific. Science is about disseminating information, in an open forum and having it be judged by peer review. So unfortunately, a lot of the data ecosystem in Iraq is behind closed doors. So I want to, before we go to the open floor, I want to turn to Gleda and Sareen again to talk about the idea of the energy transition and how it pertains to Iraq. Gleda, we'll start with you. Iraq is, and you got into some of this in your opening remarks, but maybe we can just make a bit more of a finer point on it. Iraq is hugely dependent on oil. It has a large population. It's just come out of decades of conflict. Thinking about a quote-unquote transition away from oil is very different than thinking about it in some of the other oil-rich countries in the region. Could you give us a sense of what this discourse of an energy transition looks like in the kind of regional context, and then how that plays onto the Iraqi scene?
Yeah, sure. So we're looking at some, I think, as has been mentioned many times, we don't know how fast this transition is going to happen, but it is happening. The IEA, in their scenario, shows that even with current policies, we're looking at a decline in global oil demand beginning by 2030, which is really not very long. And in terms of preparing an economy like Iraq's, like Nigeria's, like Saudi Arabia's, like Venezuela's, for that transition, you need to start as early as possible. And domestic energy transition is one part of the picture. The other part, of course, is economic diversification, and they do link together. Yes, as you say, Iraq is in a unique position given its particular vulnerabilities, but it also has some opportunities as well. It has not, and it's probably controversial amongst many of you, but it has not developed the huge array of energy-intensive industries that you see in the Gulf countries in terms of petrochemicals and refining and cement and steel. And I realize that there are ambitions to go down that route, but it also offers an opportunity not to go down that route, because we're going to face oversupply in some of those industries, and also the constraint on exports, because when there is high emissions associated with those exports. So there's that aspect, the possibility to avoid some stranded assets. There's a huge potential. Of course, we raise it every single year in reducing flaring and methane emissions in Iraq. And Iraq has joined the major coalitions on methane emissions reduction and flaring reduction. And it has this ambitious target, right, for 2028 for zero routine flaring. That's extremely ambitious. I really hope it happens. It needs all hands on deck. At the moment, Iraq flares enough gas. I think it's been estimated that would power 3 million homes, or it's about the size of what Belgium uses every year. So it's a huge amount. That's first and foremost. I think there were these satellite data has shown these huge methane plumes. Again, methane being a short-term but extremely potent climate force coming from leakages in the piping. So there's a lot of possibilities to really deliver on emissions reduction and deliver on more resilient energy systems. And that's the final point, is that, as everybody knows, energy is not that reliable in Iraq. Besides tens of billions being poured into the power sector over the last 20 years, it really hasn't delivered results for the people. Therefore, is there a different way to go? Is more decentralized solar power, for example, a real possibility that actually makes commercial sense? I would say it would be, if the regulation and legislation is there to support that.
Thank you, Gleda. So, Serene, I'm wondering if you could reflect a bit on Gleda's comments around the energy transition. But I know that your organization has done quite a bit of work on this idea of the just energy transition, which brings in the fact that whenever there's a transition of this kind, there are winners, there are losers, there are different power dynamics, and there are different impacts on vulnerable communities. And so if you could give us a sense of what this means at the MENA context, but also in Iraq.
Okay. So yeah, going back to also what Gleda mentioned, this issue of just transition, there's no such thing as when we first organized several events and activities, whether in Iraq or even in Lebanon or Tunisia and Morocco, people were, what is this concept of just energy transition that you are telling us? What is this transition? And even in Arabic, تحول أو انتقال. They are two different words. تحول is a transformation and انتقال is transition. So are we transforming our energy resources, or are we transitioning to cleaner electricity, cleaner energy, and accessible energy to everyone? So under this concept, this was very new. It's a concept that is, that has been established in the US in the early 80s by fossil fuel, workers who lost their jobs. And also, if we look in the protests, to go back to the first round, many of the Humad Dajla and the protesters from Basra actually work in these plants or work for these private organizations. And many of them, and if we look at the numbers, 25% of Iraqis live below the poverty line, and almost 20% are unemployed, which is almost 40% of the youth. So where are the job creation? And if we center this transition around new jobs will be created, yes, but for whom? What type of jobs will be created? Will the local communities benefit from these jobs? Is this a sustainable way of having an energy production and generation? Or are we continuing to become, like you mentioned, exporting? I mean, there's a lot of, this is how also the Moroccans and the Tunisians now, they're going towards green hydrogen to export surplus of energy towards Europe. If this is a sustainable type of energy that we want to produce, then a lot of new questions come at stake as energy for whom? Who will access this energy? What will be the price, the cost of the energy, and who are the winners and the losers in this new transition that we're asking for? If the same people will not have access to their land or access to their energy, then there is a question, as the previous panel mentioned this morning, about sovereignty. If our energy is going surplusing and being sent and exported outside of Iraq or Lebanon, or even Lebanon now, there's not even electricity, and Tunisia and Morocco. So again, what are we transitioning for, why, and to whom, and knowing that a lot of current jobs will be at stake because it's heavily dependent on the oil sector. Yeah.
Thank you, Sareen. We're now going to move to Q&A, both online and in person. There are mics going around. Just a couple of things. When you ask your question, please give your name, your affiliation. And we know there's a lot of experts in the room here, and probably we could have done this panel with other people. But we want short interventions, please, and keep them to questions. So we'll start here in the first row.
Thank you, Mark. My name is Aman Sharki. I'm a member of the Iraqi Parliament. I'll give a brief insight of what goes on in Iraq in energy transition and
Can you keep it to a question, please? Just a question.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
So my question is to almost everyone on the stage is, do you think that the geopolitical arena of energy sector fight will let Iraq go mostly through this energy transition phase? And my second question is to Dr. Turan. Regarding minimal government financing, 3-year budget, from what I have heard, high percentages of this budget has not been spent. What to do with a 3-year budget if the money is not going to be spent, if it's going to be kept, and if the cabinet time is over, what's the use? Thank you.
Thank you, Amanj. We'll do one more question in the center of Tama, please.
Thank you, Mac. Tamer Badawi, Peace Paradigms. I have this following question for Turhan and Sameh. So Iraqi political elites are deeply intertwined with the private sector, often aligning public interests with their own financial interests. To address Iraq's environmental and climate vulnerabilities, should we focus on designing environmental protection and climate mitigating initiatives that align with their profit motives, thereby incentivizing their support and engagement? So, I mean, basically, how can we mobilize the private sector for more climate and environmental related projects? Thank you.
Okay, we will do another round here in a second. So we have a question about geopolitics and the intersection between geopolitics and the energy transition. Let's start with that one. Perhaps we could have Gleda have a shot at that.
Okay, I'll give one angle on it. I think there is, I mean, I listened to a discussion that's available on YouTube with the multilateral development banks and some country actors, including Kazakhstan and Nigeria, on this issue of transition and transition finance. And there's a real interest from the banks in forming pragmatic and realistic partnerships to achieve this. So I think the will is there to try to build the conditions to attract in private sector investment. If you're talking about the question of gas power, then the World Bank is already in there. I think the need is for the conditions domestically to come and meet that halfway. There's also an issue with conflicting types of investment. The last time I looked, China was investing in an oil-fired power plant, for example, for about $5 billion. At the same time, you've got solar investments going in from Saudi, from UAE. There's a kind of a plethora of projects there, and maybe a willingness to sort of take everything to get more power, and yet they're probably conflicting with each other. So probably the need for more alignment. I'll stop there. There's lots to say about the wider political environment, but that's from the donor perspective.
Thank you, Gleda. So on the government finance piece, and perhaps we'll combine these two questions that basically come down to, what is the reality of government financing, and then also what is the reality of the political actors that are, quite interested in that financing. So could you give us a sense, Dr. Torhan, of the, this claim that actually a lot of the budget hasn't been spent, but particularly in relation to water infrastructures and climate policy, because we don't need to generalize about the whole budget.
Yeah. In general, if this money in budget does not spend, but that money is already nominated for the project. So it is still in the name of the project. Maybe it will be late, but it is still for that project. And for example, if it is not nominated for the any project, it will be rotated to the next budget. So the money will still.
So you don't see any problems here? Everything's
No,
fine.
the problem it's about the time, about the period. Yeah, we're losing time, but there is no losing for money.
Okay. Well, we'll see. Yeah, we'll see what the new elections bring us in terms of the future of this fiscal arrangement. So, Sam, I'm wondering if you could basically engage with the question about the private sector, and is there a kind of maybe you could give a slightly critical view of this.
There are a couple nice proposals in terms of green entrepreneurs and green business and circular economy. And this is going to help to cope with the mitigation and adaptation plans. However, this is a very easy statement to do it on the paper, but when it comes to reality, it will be rather hard to practice. Why? Because we have different obstacles here. We're dealing with poor infrastructure. We're dealing with very fuzzy regulations in this aspect, and we also have no access to finance for this nice ideas. But at the same time, if we have a look on the progress, at least in terms of legislations, because one of the main issue for the foundation of the how to deal with the climate change as a new animal here is the legislations itself. We don't have the regulations to deal with that new animal. But what's happening is in the last couple of years, there is a nice concern from the legislation body. We work with them together to work to develop at least some nice ideas and policies. Probably Kak Amanji is one of them who has been involved with the energy transition policies. But the problem is, and this is for you as well, the technology nowadays is much faster than regulations. And this is what we should really bring them together. So whatever we invest in technology, we need to be sure that it comes hand in hand with regulations. And this is one of the key issues, I would say, in Iraq nowadays.
Okay. We're going to do another 3 questions, but the first of the 3 will be one from online, so just try and remember it. So the question is, how does climate change impact women and girls in Iraq?
كيف
Women are
يؤثر
affected
على
differently than men
النساء
because of their
والفتيات
roles in
في
family
العراق
caregiving, their
والنساء بشكل
responsibility to
مختلف
provide access to clean
بالتأكيد
water at all times.
لعدة أسباب.
And this is from Dr. Ilham.
وهذا السؤال من الدكتورة
We'll take 2 more
إلهام.
on top of that. Yasar, go
أعني
ahead.
كيف يؤثر التغير المناخي على النساء والفتيات في
Thank you very much,
العراق.
Mark. Thank you,
تتأثر النساء
the
بنحو
panelists.
مختلف طبعا. شكرا
يسار
معك
المالكي, Gulf
وشكرا
analyst at MACE.
للمشاركين.
My
يسار
question is
المالكي
for
محلل
Gleda. Always
الخليج
good to listen to
في
her.
ميس. سؤالي
With
لجليدا،
the pull and push that is expected, with
سياسة
the US
الشد
changing its climate
والجذب
change policy, with the EU
المتوقعة في ضوء
continuing
التغير.
their efforts as is. You talked about the OPEC Plus contingent. I just want to know how their position will morph, and also where would Iraq place itself in this changing dynamic? Thank you.
Okay, Ra'ad.
Hi, I'm Ra'ad Al-Qadri from CSIS. It's a question on the other side of the energy transitions, and that is, there's a lot of focus on climate mitigation, but what planning is being done in terms of climate adaptation and resilience, which arguably is a more urgent need for Iraq, statistics aside, and where is the money and planning and organization for that coming from?
Thank you, Ra'ad. So we'll start with Sareen on the question regarding women and girls.
Okay. Maybe also we'll address some other questions on the geopolitics.
Sure, please.
I think yes, Iraq is member of the G77 plus China, is a member of the Arab bloc, but there's not a unified even position vis-a-vis. And we know who controls the stakes. Yeah, it's Saudi Arabia that dominates the discussions around oil, and it will always be the representative of in negotiations and international negotiations, as we see it at the COP and other multilateral summits. There's a summit coming soon in Riyadh in a couple of weeks. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talks now about climate finance, but our countries, unfortunately, and again, we are not one bloc. Yeah? The Middle East, and the North Africans are very close to the Europeans, and they think of bilateral agreements with the Europeans. The Middle East, we have our own wars and a series of weak states. But vis-a-vis Iraq and other countries, I think there's also an opportunity for having more financial mechanisms coming towards Iraq today, specifically in the international negotiations for adaptation projects rather than on the mitigation, because we're not the ones who have contributed historically to these emissions. I mean, we know this, and this is also the statement of many different countries. But on the girls and women, of course, I mean, if we look at Iraq, even historically, we have lost land, and displacement has also happened. And in displacement, women and girls will also, at the same time, be affected the most. I mean, they're the ones who are the caretakers. And if we look at not just in Iraq, but also other places, if we look in Lebanon, in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, I mean, the women are at the center of their households. And this is, and not just at the household, and even now we're seeing more women are, because of displacement, because of wars, are going back to the market to work. So if we have more and more climate changes, and if we have more and more precipitation, droughts, and it will affect the woman to in the household, the household, and also how will they adapt to the changes, and how they will also support their own communities and their own families. So this will be, of course, affecting their livelihoods, their security, their safety, much more than it is already at stake at the moment.
You know, I imagine it's a critical part of the whole just energy transition framework. So the question about OPEC Plus for Gleda?
Yeah, good question. You can probably answer it better than me. But I think Iraq will continue to play in that non-aligned space. You know, it will want to form alliances with everyone in a way. EU and China being particularly important for its exports. So that's worth bearing in mind, and its closeness to the BRICS is something to watch. And I think the in terms of what happens with the U.S., of course, it's a big hit. I mean, it's really damaging for global action on climate change. Having said that, nobody quite knows how it will play out. Nobody knows if Trump will pull the U.S. Out of the Paris Agreement, which would then be very difficult to come back into. So they may coast along on that one and just try to throw some spanners in the works. A really interesting question is what role the U.S. now plays in the multilateral development banks, particularly in the World Bank, where it's the major funder. Does that diminish those possibilities I was talking about earlier for just transition finance? And then finally, I think that the partnership with the EU could be really interesting. It's definitely as Iraq sees itself as growing exports to the EU, already has partnerships on climate resilience with players within the EU, with donors within the EU. So yeah, it will try to hedge those bets and see what comes. But these are really critical years. I mean, I just have to stress that between now and 2030, this is our chance globally to get our act together.
Sama, you had a...
Yes, only one thing to answer, probably reflect on the adaptation question. A fresh message from the COP29. The cost of the global economy in terms of the weather events is more than $2 trillion for the last decade. And more than 1.6 billion people, they have been affected by climate change. Again, to dedicate financial, and this need definitely a solid and effective financial plan from the Iraqi government, and I believe they able to do that. If we can have this effective financial plan for the long run, even beyond, and this is very important for what I had mentioned at the beginning about the paradigm of shift in leadership philosophy, because most of the politicians, they think on their period of time they're going to serve in this chair. But if there is a strategic project will be open even beyond their period, and it could be credit goes to the opposition party, they will be not interested. And this is why we need really to focus and invest more in the financial plan, because adaptation now, if we do it, it's going to be cheaper than in the near future.
Dr. Torhan, did you have any follow-up on the question around climate adaptation?
No, I think they did well.
Great. We'll take three more. Ali, you had your, yeah, go ahead. Can the mic come up to the front here, please? Yeah.
Thanks, Mac. Ali Jack, PR Manager of Ruda. My question is to Dr. Torhan. Do you financially support the KRG in dam building projects? If not, what are your alternatives in terms of location? Thank you.
Let's go to the back. Do we have a mic back there? Okay, yeah.
Hi, Matt Amatrano from U.S. Department of State. I thought I would just ask a question on education, because I hear about research and what's being done to actually provide degrees in environmental science and water management, land management, because that will help create jobs to provide what Dr. Sama was saying. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Hamid Al-Kifai. I'm an economist and academic. I have two questions, actually, regarding the environment. One of them regarding the shortage of water, desertification, which is caused by our two neighbors. Obviously, Iraqi rivers flow from Turkey, the main rivers, but there are rivers and tributaries flow from Iran, and they have been diverted, 40 of them, and that caused the lack of 30 billion cubic meters of water every year. And the Iraqi government, successive governments, not just this regime, the previous regime as well, didn't negotiate with Iran. To be fair to the Iraqi government, successive governments, that they have negotiated with Turkey, but not with Iran, even though 40 rivers and tributaries have been diverted into Iran. The second one is regarding gas flaring in the south. This has caused an environmental and health disaster in Iraq, caused diseases, cancerous diseases. Why the Iraqi government has ignored this huge problem, double whammy. It caused, a huge problem in the south, especially in Basra. Why they have ignored this problem and also wasted Iraqi wealth. This gas is burnt in the air and polluting the environment and causing health problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's actually start in reverse and get to this question about gas flaring, because I do think it's important. Dr. Torhan?
First of all, like what you said about the associated gas, now Iraq is produce about 60% from the associated gas. So it's about 65. So we still have 35% is unused for producing power. We're going forward, maybe in next 4 years will be 100% useful for associated gas in producing power, especially in Basra. This is the first. The second question, it was about the dams in KRG. Dams issue is federal issue. So whatever or wherever there is rebuilding or repairing or for the dams, it will be federal issue. It will be from the central government budget. But there is kind of dams that we said it in Arabic, hasilat al-miyah. That is domestical issue. Even in most of the provinces, it's domestical issue. It's local issue, sorry. So the big dams like Dokan, another dams, it's federal. And now there is several projects to repair and to fix these dams. So it's federal issue.
Okay. Let's move to the question around education, environmental science, and this whole kind of, educational landscape. Sama, do you want to give it?
Actually, it is an excellent question. Thank you very much for this wonderful question. Basically, usually we invest in awareness in general, but there is different level of awareness. We have an awareness in decision making, awareness in organization level, and we do have a public awareness, and we do have an education awareness. We have done a screening for 1.5 years for the education system in Iraq. And you will figure out it's very poor in terms of environmental aspects and how to deal with the climate change impact and even with the water resource securities and so on. So there is an acute need to invest in that direction. And some local institutes, they doing that, but in the private sector. And what surprised me is to find a school. This school is a private school. They've been given the permission by Ministry of Education. But if you go to their syllabus and you figure out it's rich in terms of environmental aspects, but if you go to the public school, they are rather poor also. The permission has come from the same entity. And this is why I believe I do agree 100% that we should go to that direction and invest in education, because this is what will help Iraq for the long run and back up the whole system. And just one thing I would like to emphasize of what Dr. Torhan mentioned about the technical terminology for the dams. In KRG, this is correct. This is right that we have to manage our resources from the federal area. There is a central system that the federal government, they really responsible for any dams within the Iraqi territories. However, the water harvesting dams that is built now in Kurdistan region is extremely important for the whole country. Why? Because it's not that dams that controlling water, it's collecting water, and instead of we are losing this water by evaporation. So I just want to emphasize on that, not to misunderstand between dams on the mainstream and the water harvesting dams.
Right. We're going to come back to the question about Iran because that's important, but I wanted to highlight just a question that came in from online from Shayan Kamil. She notes that three of the core values in the kind of national strategy for Iraq emphasize social effects and human rights. Safe right to the environment, attention to social and cultural diversity. But the strategy seems to focus mostly on raising awareness and educational efforts rather than meaningful participation in decision-making. So how can the government ensure that local communities are actively involved as partners in decision-making? I think this would be a good question for both Dr. Torhan and Sareen. Torhan, obviously, because the government perspective, but then Sareen, this seems to relate quite closely to the Just Energy Transition framework. So maybe we'll start with you, and then we can go to Torhan.
Yes, okay. All right. It goes back also to the question of education and knowledge. This is something we see a lot. Who's producing knowledge? Who's generating knowledge? And there is a wonderful professor, you might have heard of him, Shukri Al-Hassan from the University of Basra. He's maybe you've seen him on the BBC documentary as well. So there is a lot of there are voices. There are a lot of young voices of people generating knowledge, trying in universities, in different informal sectors as well, to try to generate accurate repercussions of, as you mentioned, the gas flaring and what are their impacts on public health and the impacts on different communities and marginalized communities. But some of them, their voices are either shut down at the end or they are threatened in a way. But of course, it is definitely important. There are also networks of several civil society organizations that have established earlier this year the Basra Network for Environment, Climate and Security. It's a consortium of different civil society actors that came together to share different knowledge and information across on environmental issues. So there are initiatives that have happened. There are also entrepreneurs, as we have heard yesterday, who have established young startups to be able to penetrate this private sector and so on. So there are different ways and so on. And also your institution, which we're working with, have created the Science Citizen Assembly, or even in other places, to understand how do you link knowledge to the local communities, how do you use science and inform communities and involve them into the decision-making processes. I think this is something that is very important also that there are several initiatives that have happened. I think I've answered the question, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sareen. Torhan, we do hear...
More finance also should be given to these institutions.
Right.
So support for research, support
Sure.
for public knowledge, availability of knowledge that is not just hidden if it's a study, but available to everyone to comment on it, to reflect on it, and participate actively in decision making.
So Torhan, just to kind of focus the question a bit, we hear a lot from the government, from the Sudani government, that they're open to civil society, they want to involve them in things. But we do hear often a critique from civil society that actually on environmental issues, they're not really involved in decision making. It's more kind of a kind of promotional effort from the government. So can you give us a sense of what the efforts are and what the progress is on this?
Okay, as I mentioned before, to repair the environment or the ecosystem, it's not just like sewage you can make on or off. Iraq suffered as an ecosystem from decades. So now when we start to repair the environment system, it will take time. And to involve with NGOs, there is several NGOs now working with the government for proving or improving kind of clean power. But it is still experimental. I would like to give an example about that. We worked before years ago with some NGOs for producing electricity for waste management. When we end the project, we've been face to face, there is no legislation about that. So how we can buy, how we can sell. So like Sam said, we need some time for the legislations in order to can work in this kind of issues. Now we have this kind of legislation. So step by step, we will work on that, and even with the NGOs. The other question about the rivers from Iran. You know, the water supply who come in Iraq, we used to have about 55% from Turkey and about 20% from the whole water, especially from Tigris River, from Iran, and the other from Iraq. From Iran to Iraq, there was about 45, 46 many rivers start to be stopped or change the direction to Iraq. Now there is working on that because one of the problems between Iraq and Iran, you know, there is اتفاقية الجزائر, Algeria agreement. Iraq did not admit anymore with Algeria agreement. Iran depend on that. Another point, even in this kind of agreement, because it's established in 70s, so there was, in that time, there wasn't any kind of water crisis. So there is no items or there is no important items about the water sharing or water supply. For that, we are kind of suffering with the Iran side about the waters. Now there is kind of legislation. We start working on kind of legislation and kind of understanding with the Iran about that.
So we're going to close here with two final comments from Samah and Gleda. Samah, I'm wondering if you can reflect on Dr. Torhan's perspective related to Iran, Iraq, and Turkey transboundary flows. And then Gleda, if you can perhaps give us a broader kind of geopolitical context for thinking about transboundary water negotiations.
So, okay. Transboundary water is, I would say, it's a challenge that Iraq is suffering from back to 1920, when the Iraq has emerged as a state. We are living in geographical presence as an outcome for the First World War. And at that time, start the conflict between nations around water resources. Water doesn't respect or give no weight to this political border. But if we make it in simple calculation, if we're going to go to how Iran is influenced Iraq in terms of water resources, there are two main parts, which is Sirwan River, Nahr Diyala River, and we do have Shatt al-Arab. This is where Iran would influence Iraq in terms of water resources. However, if we make a simple calculation and just calculate whatever Iran has been controlled from water resources and compare it with what we have it from Turkey as well, we're going to find the whole what Iran control, it's probably compare only to one dam from Turkey. This doesn't mean that we should not reach an agreement with Iran. Each single drop of water, it matters for Iraqi perspective. But end of the day, we have to be more rational. And we have to tend more to focus on why these dams, massive dams, has been built from Turkey side. I can imagine that Turkey, at the state level, they do have their own needs, but we need, end of the day, to negotiate agreements. And by the way, most of the negotiation, and when it comes to signing MOU or a protocol, and sometimes they say, Turkey they say, or Iran they say, they're going to say, okay, we're going to share with you a fair water allocation. But fairness in terms of Turkey, this is, sounds different than what fairness from our side. Thank you.
Sorry, sir. Gleda, final comment on this?
Thank you. So I think we have to move away from looking at transboundary water as a zero-sum game, which has really stymied cooperation in the past. Every country surrounding Iraq should have an interest in a healthy river basin ecosystem and stability in Iraq, which will be deeply affected by the water flows. But so I think there's three things here. One is a few years ago in 2021 under Barham Saleh, there was a group of NGOs, consultants, who drew up the Mesopotamian Revitalization Initiative. I think that is sitting, gathering dust on a shelf somewhere, and should be revitalized because it does provide a good framework for looking at this on a regional basis and looking at development issues too that are connected with the river. Secondly, dust storms. So as have been mentioned, this is a real reason for the region to cooperate. So it's in the interests of the Gulf states, of Kuwait, of Saudi Arabia, of UAE to help invest actually in land revitalization and in restoring rivers in Iraq so that dust does not come and hit them harder. And there is some cooperation going on that front. And thirdly, I just want to mention land management. Our State Department colleague mentioned this earlier, so important for Iraq's diversification. 33% are employed in the rural areas, very, very different from the GCC countries, more similar to Morocco, if anything. And this is where Iraq can really help manage that balance of trade problem that it's going to run into with declining oil revenues in terms of lowering the food bill, which is massive at the moment.
Before we let you all off to lunch, a couple of points that are important to underscore. One is that this panel obviously was a very vibrant and important discussion, but we were missing one member, Jassim Al-Asadi, co-founder of Nature Iraq and probably the foremost environmental activist in Iraq, inexplicably denied a UK visa. Just a couple of notes. You have a feedback form that's available through the QR code on your badge. Please make use of that. Lunch will be upstairs, and we will start promptly the next session at 1:45. So please join me in thanking the panel.